I'm thrilled to announce our next speaker, Mike Fisher. Mike is Etsy's Chief Technology Officer, setting a technology strategy and helping to further scale Etsy's global platform. Prior to joining Etsy, he was the co-founder and managing partners of the consulting firm AKF Partners. Mike's career in technology has also included the role of Chief Technology Officer of Quigo, Vice President of Engineering and Architecture for PayPal, and various roles at GE, helping to develop the company's technology strategy. He has also co-authored 2 books on scalability and has written numerous articles on business growth. Mike is a veteran who served as a captain and pilot in the US Army. Mike is joined by Alexandr Wang, CEO and founder at Scale. Alex, over to you.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Alex. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. We'll probably spend most of the time talking about Etsy and e-commerce, but I want to call it, you're also a veteran. You served as a captain in the U.S. Army as well as a pilot in the U.S. Army, and we actually have a lot of speakers, either former vets or current members of the Department of Defense or the services at TransformX this year. So it's super exciting to see you have that background and as well as work at one of the most iconic technology companies in the world.
Well, thanks. Yeah, like I said, I appreciate being here. Thanks for the opportunity. And I do think, a lot of that background in the military has, the leadership and management I've been able to bring that over, and excited that I've been able to leverage that in my career.
Yeah, awesome. Well, so you're the CTO of Etsy. Maybe to just tee off for some of the folks in the audience who may not have used Etsy, what is Etsy?
Yeah, so Etsy is a global marketplace that brings together buyers and sellers one at a time for handmade and vintage items. And we do this across over 100 million items. So just this massive amount of items that our creative sellers bring in, and it's everything from art to furniture to clothing, across categories as diverse as weddings to home and living. And we do that. Our mission is to keep commerce human. And we really believe this idea that, there's of course a space for, mass production of e-commerce items. We all need that in our lives, but there's also a space for special. And that's where we shine. We shine with our sellers who make such special items that often people can't find, or they can't be customized, they can't be made, different sizes or different colors, exactly what they want. And that's what our sellers bring. And we're super excited. We're the marketplace that brings those together and keeps commerce human.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think bringing this sort of, the sort of analog, parallel would be, you walk into a boutique, or maybe you walk by a merchant on the street and you sort of buy some of their handmade goods. I think it's such a magical, experience, and bringing that to e-commerce is extremely powerful, because it's also the kind of thing that, these massive platforms like Amazon or whatnot, it's not what they're built for at all, and it's hard for them to accommodate that user.
That's exactly right. I mean, where else can you go that you can reach out to the seller and talk to them directly about the item? You can ask questions. You can ask for something special to be done. You can get that communication, and then you often get that special note from the seller about how they made it, or their shop, or the impact, and know that you're supporting small business. 97% are solopreneurs, about these individuals working out of their garages and basements, making these fantastic items. It's super, super amazing. Yeah.
So what first drew you to Etsy, and what are you excited about as being the Chief Technology Officer?
So my history with Etsy dates back to just before or right after they started. So they were founded in 2007. I met them in 2008 when I was running a consultancy that focused on scaling. So the company that I co-founded with some partners focused on helping often startups who are in that hypergrowth phase, the hockey stick phase, and they were having trouble scaling technology. So we worked with just hundreds of startups. We worked with really big companies that have massive scale problems and sort of everything in between. So I got to meet Etsy when they were having their first scale problems, which was a good thing to have, right? As a startup, you want that to happen. And so I met them, and I remember leaving there and telling some family and friends like, "Oh, I met this really cool startup. They help, I called them at the time, and still like creative entrepreneurs. They help these creative entrepreneurs, these sellers, find their raving fans. And as a before Etsy Marketplace, you can imagine, like you said, you had to go to some sort of fair or sidewalk or something and try to connect with people. And we made that possible. And people can now be in their hometowns and make these amazing products. So I met them really, really early. I continued to work with the company as a consultant over the years with different projects, and I really started to gain admiration for their engineering culture. And of course, they're very famous for things like their observability and the blameless postmortems. And I just really respected their engineering team. And then when there was a leadership change in 2017, I got brought back in as a consultant to help them look at some scaling issues with the org side. And one thing led to another, and Josh Silverman, the now CEO, asked if I would stay. And I said, of course, for Etsy. That's now been 5 years. Yeah, super excited that I've known this company for so long and admired it from the outside, and got the opportunity to join them as their chief technology officer. And yeah, it's been a great journey.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, speaking of scaling, Etsy has scaled as a marketplace to now over 100 million buyers, 5 million sellers, just astronomical numbers. What are some of the core focus areas that you think about in terms of being able to transform and continue innovating on the business?
Yeah, when I think about engineering teams, I think of people, process, and technology. And so I think about all three of those have to work together and scale together. And so, when I first joined, we had about 250 engineers. We now have we're closing in on 1,000. And so one thing that I've thought about over these years is how to scale that from an organization, to make sure that this is the place that can be great for engineers to come and develop their careers. And then I think about process of like, as you scale that many engineers and grow that quickly to support the marketplace growing, as you mentioned, then we've got to have processes in place to make sure that the developer experience is smooth and easy. You don't want to come to work as an engineer and be frustrated that you can't push code quickly. And so maintaining our ability to push in a continuous deployment process 50 plus times a day is really important. And so that's the process side. Then of course the technology side to scale. When I came in, we were still in data centers, and the team had already been thinking about moving to the cloud. But we sort of formalized that and decided that we were going to make the move to the cloud so that we could scale our infrastructure without being really, reliant on having to do that 6+ month cycle of ordering hardware, getting it built, getting it shipped, and racking and stacking that. And so in 2017, we started that migration, and we actually finished. We sort of declared the end of it complete in January or February of 2020, which, as you recall, was about a month before the pandemic. And so we finished literally just before the pandemic. And in March, when in 2020, when guidance came out about masks, everybody came searching on Etsy for masks. And really, our traffic doubled overnight, and being in the cloud really allowed us to scale. So those are some of the things that I think about, along with Etsy Engineering, is how do we support this marketplace? It's always fine tuning those three sort of dials of the people, process, and technology.
Yeah, totally, and 100%. Like at the end of the day, companies are the teams that are building all of the incredible technology and projects and products that end up being shipped to customers. So it's definitely it's an area where there's like a lot of gains in focusing. One of the things that the Etsy engineering team has written about on the blog post, Code is Craft. They've written about using machine learning to build a recommendation system for more than 100 million item catalog listings, which is just again, speaking of scale, astronomical scale. And I think that a lot of the problems around the sort of the catalog are actually really unintuitive for most people. I think most engineers or most product people don't really end up thinking about, oh, actually all of this data in the catalog is a really complex problem to be able to manage, and that is the data that fuels a lot of the sort of machine learning algorithms at the end of the day. So what were some of the some of the problems that you and your team have faced in dealing with, first, just the scale of that catalog at Etsy, and how have you sort of uncovered those problems over time?
Yeah, you're exactly right. The way I describe Etsy is, if you imagine an iceberg, what you see above the water is the marketplace. And everybody knows the marketplace interacts. What you don't see that's actually under the water is we're really a big data and machine learning company. And as you mentioned, we've got 100 million plus items that have no SKUs, that have no catalog. Some of the items fit across categories, as you can imagine. They are described, the images that are taken, and they are described by the sellers. And so they can describe it in any way that they would want. All of that unstructured data makes it, and the volume of data makes it incredibly complex. We also capture billions of events a day from the marketplace to then process and power machine learning engines. And so we've really been on a journey over the last 5+ years to make sure that, in this sort of sea of 100 million items, when the buyers come to the site, we can help them find exactly what they want as quickly as possible. The typical, sort of text-based, search algorithms based on, Solr and so forth, and, using, TF-IDF and things like that. But you can imagine the difficulties, as I mentioned, because this unstructured data that the sellers have. And so we started, adding models on top of that with things like re-ranking. And, if you imagine sort of the request response chain, we actually have worked on every single layer of that. The very first thing that happens is, as you're typing in, we think about helping, query suggestions. And so bringing up what other people have searched for, or that what we know, you might be looking for, it starts there. And then as we move down into that information retrieval area, we start looking at like what we call query understanding and thinking about, how do we classify this query into our taxonomy? And we have taxonomy classifiers, and we have historical query indexing that we use, all to try to understand this query as it's being passed back into this information retrieval layer. And then, that information retrieval layer, what we've started out with, that very simple text-based search, is now very complex. And we use a combination of graph-based and vector-based in the form of neural information retrieval, along with text-based, of course, and we can merge that together to get the candidate set. And then we pass that up to the ranking layer. And the ranking layer has gone through tons of iterations where we take that candidate set and re-rank it for the most likely items that user, the buyer, is looking for. And we started with, sort of fairly simple linear regression algorithms. We had multiple models of that. And then we eventually, migrated that into gradient boost decision trees. And we, worked on things like joint optimization. So, thinking about the idea that there's not just one, perfect objective, that there could be multiple objectives that the buyer is looking for, and being able to merge those all in that final re-ranking. And we've now introduced deep neural nets for that final re-ranking as well. So we've gone through this, this multiple year journey of applying machine learning models at every single layer of the search. Because it's so complex that we're trying to take this massive amount of unstructured data and find out exactly what the buyer wants. And of course, it has to be performant. This has to be done in, a matter of seconds and process all of this. And that's another piece of this that is all about the infrastructure that we've had to either build or leverage in order to support this.
Yeah, totally. Well, I'm going to want to dive into all the various pieces of what you just mentioned. But maybe the first one is just starting at the at the most simplistic level. Like you mentioned, the information about your products are entered by the sellers, and so it's user-generated content. I bet some of the images look really good, some of the images don't look so good. Some of the text is people are really descriptive and it's really good. Some of the folks maybe put less effort into that, and naively, you'd think that folks who maybe don't put in the effort in describing their products, they'll have challenges being discovered and sort of like getting their products fully discovered through these search algorithms. How do you think about this challenge just at the outset of basically ensuring that all this unstructured data that you have is high quality, is rich, is detailed enough to enable the sort of like proper discovery and ranking of the products?
Yeah, it's really challenging because of the breadth that sellers can innovate on with their creative products. And so instead of trying to restrict them or force them into catalogs, categories, things like that, we try to allow that to be as open as possible and then look at it as our job to then interpret that. And one of the things that we sort of have worked on the last couple of years is that what we call closing the semantic gap. And so you're exactly right. The sellers might make a beautiful, sports coat, but you might look for that as a blazer, and the seller might not list blazer at all in their product. They might refer to it as a sports coat, and we've got to have enough knowledge in our system to bring that together and close that semantic gap. And that really brought us to the graph-based solutions that I mentioned. That this idea that we think about, a seller can have a shop, she can have multiple shops. These shops can have many, many listings, hundreds or more of listings, and they can describe them all differently. And then they merge with all the other listings that are similar. But we've got data about what resonated with somebody previously. So we also have that data about if someone did search for a blazer and they saw this item, did they interact with it? Did they, either like it, favorite it, add to a collection, hopefully eventually, add to cart and so forth. But we have that data, and because we can build these graphs of listings, we can start looking at them as what is similar to that, and we can use that data from one listing to connect over to another listing through the graph. And that's been really powerful in helping closing this and trying to get all of those, all of that difficulty with language and close that so that what you search for really is, it might not be at all in what the seller has, but it's exactly what you're looking for.
Yeah, totally. Another piece that you kind of mentioned in your overall architecture was this sort of this candidate, sort of the candidate selection and ranking piece, which, as you mentioned, it merges, kind of as you described, it merges the sort of like graph-based approach, which is, you have a lot of insight based off of the user's interactions and how they traverse through all the different products, et cetera. Also the neural approaches that you mentioned for embeddings, which likely, probably, runs off the images and text independently, and sort of you can get that signal. And so as you've sort of combined multiple approaches into sort of these more multimodal kind of setups, what have you found in terms of the challenges of maybe introducing new signals into this setup, and then where do you think it's going to go? Like, do you think it's going to go towards a fully neural network-based architecture over time? Like, how do you sort of see it evolving?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So that's it. We take text, that sort of TDF, IDF based, Solr-based text stuff. We take this graph candidate set, and we take neural information retrieval. And right now, we take parts of all of those and merge them. And that's very difficult to do in real time, you know, between the request and what we're responding with. Do it in real time, dedupe, and of course, serve that up. The challenge that we're working on now is could those percentages of candidates come from each of those areas differ based on the query? We've got super long tail queries. We've got broad, kind of the head versus tail queries. So some people search for gift, which is super broad, and the candidate set selection from different tiers might differ than if I search for gold necklace, gold name necklace, or something like that, that is more specific. And so right now we're thinking about this dynamically changing based on the type of query that we see, the search query that we see. We can change this. I think there is right now we see the room for all three of these to continue to grow. Eventually, graph is very powerful, as is of course the neural, the neural information retrieval layer. But I would not be surprised if we saw all three of these continue to be in place for multiple years until, I think eventually, like you said, the neural network and the graph is probably going to, win out over time.
Yep. And across all these problems, one of the themes that we see across a lot of machine learning problems is that there's improvements you can make in the algorithm, there's improvements you can make in the data, and in many cases, you're often bottlenecked by one or the other in a lot of situations. What have sort of you've seen as you've worked on a lot of these problems? Have you seen greater gains in algorithmic improvements versus data improvements, and how has that sort of changed over time?
Yeah, I think my perspective on this is that we are here in this sort of day and age in which machine learning is so powerful, in large part because of the advances in amounts of data and compute. I think many of the algorithms that we're still using today, we've actually had for decades, and certainly they're being improved, but we've had the basis of this for many decades. But what has really sort of opened up the possibility for us and for lots of other companies is the massive amount of data that we can store and the compute that we can power this from. And so I think it's a data-centric machine learning is really sort of the stage that we're at right now. And I think that massive volumes of data is what's the most powerful and will be for the next several years. Eventually, the runway for that might run out, but I think we're still seeing massive gains in what we can do by pulling in this data and leveraging. We turn this into, as you can imagine, hundreds of engineered features that we then leverage, and that is super powerful.
Yeah, and one of the things I also want to touch on, because the scale of 100 million listings, that's pretty rare in e-commerce, generally speaking, that introduces a whole new set of challenges around the long tail of your products. You can't, there's no, you obviously have to do algorithmically 100 million items is just way too many to sort of curate it any sort of way. How have you thought about this sort of like long tail sort of retrieval problem, or the long tail discovery problem, and making sure that as much of the catalog gets properly discovered as possible?
Yeah, you're exactly right that you've got this incredibly broad and eventually this super long tail of products. And so being able to come up with candidate sets for those queries and those products is really important. What we don't want is for someone to come there and look for an item and for us to not find a great candidate set of items. And so that's a ton of the work has been around making sure that, I mentioned that when we first receive the query inbound, we look at things like historical queries and taxonomy. And so we've got algorithms that look at this query even before it's passed to the information retrieval layer, that is trying to put it in context of other queries that we've seen, that historical query. And we're also trying to classify it within our taxonomy so that we can provide that, get that item from a very, very long tail in there. And that's the approach that we've taken, because it is very important that items that might be that are 100% super unique, only can be found on Etsy, we want that buyer to be able to find it and find it quickly, not have to parse through even hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands. We want it down to, the first couple of pages of results. This brings up kind of what we do to test a lot of this is we do a lot of offline testing. So we're fairly well known in the industry for online A/B experiments. We're very good at that. We've got a really strong infrastructure that allows us. But what we've also found is that it's important to test offline. So before we even get our algorithms into production, we run through many, sometimes hundreds of iterations on our models offline. And we've even built tools and infrastructure to allow us to look at that and to look at things like NDCG with search results to see how would this model have performed in production based on all the queries that we saw over the past 30, 60, 90 days. And we can then make sure that it's not only finding the right candidate set that would be best for the buyers, but we're also, like you said, getting the super long tail of results.
Yep. And kind of a related problem is the sort of new merchants. It's sort of a cold start problem as well, right? So new merchant comes online. Nobody's ever bought anything of mine on Etsy or ever searched any of it or whatnot. And so a lot of those historical features aren't there. How have you thought about, from a machine learning perspective, solving this sort of like cold start problem from the merchant standpoint?
Yeah, and as you can imagine, in the past, the distance past, there were things like boost. So you would give, right, this is the problem of, trying to figure out, the giving some amount of views, to discover versus the optimization. And, a lot of the very simplified would just give a fixed amount, of sort of views to something to try to get a sense. Ads have this problem all the time in ad networks, but we're way more advanced than that. And this is one thing that's led us to the graph-based indexing, because you can drop a brand new item in there, and we can take cues from that we learn from the image and that we learn from the text, and we can then start putting it in the graph close to other items that have similar text, similar computer vision, image recognition. We can look for the style. We can now determine the style of these. So we can start dropping this in the graph where it's most like other items. And that helps tremendously with the cold start problem.
Cool. Well, switching gears a little bit, one of the things that, looking forward from here, thinking ahead for over the next few years, as well as how AI is going in general, what do you think are some of the ways in which AI is going to continue influencing e-commerce and Etsy? And what are some of the directions of the technology that you're really excited about?
Yeah, I think, certainly within all of e-commerce, machine learning is going to become more and more important. And the move, as you mentioned, towards more neural networks. We now use neural networks on all layers of our search. And that's going to we're going to continue to see that. I think, we're going to continue to iterate on this and get better and better. The more, as I mentioned, the more data and the more compute we can bring to this, then the more real time, super sophisticated, instead of just using, a couple dozen feature sets, we can now use multiple hundreds of feature sets and continue putting in these engineered features from the data that we can't even think about, sort of looking at the data as humans. We can't even sort of think about this idea of what might be important, but the combinations of them, as we know, oftentimes it's combinations of these features that are important, and by bringing massive amounts of data. So I think that's going to continue not only for us, but all e-commerce. And then the other thing that we're really pushing is what I've called the democratization of machine learning. I really do believe Etsy as a marketplace, almost every piece of the marketplace, from when the seller first starts her listing and starts typing, we can be there to suggest that either the category or the tags that she might want to use on her items. We could be there and talk about the image that she's uploading and make sure they're high enough quality, all the way through, of course, the buyer journey, the recommendations, the checkout. All of that could be powered by some level of machine learning. And so we've been really pushing within all of Etsy engineering to get this ability and knowledge into all of our product teams. And so we now have data scientists that used to be centralized and working on just the problems that we assign them out in the teams, so they can work with all the teams and all the various problems across the Etsy marketplace. And I think that's a big differentiator for us, is that I envision this world in which all of the product teams can implement everything from very simple machine learning models that they could do themselves to have a data scientist beside them to implement the most sophisticated. And I think that's the sort of future that we see within Etsy is, this machine learning is going to power all aspects of the marketplace, and all the teams are going to feel empowered to leverage that.
Well, switching gears a little bit to another really important problem, or sort of important vector where technology is used in a lot of these problems. Digital trust and safety is at the forefront of a lot of conversations today for all sorts of platforms, and especially two-sided marketplaces, and especially ones where there's a lot of user-generated content, and as we've talked about, Etsy is about enabling really creative sellers and buyers to be able to create incredible things. The question for you is how do you think about building trust and safety on the platform, and what are sort of the main efforts that you think about for Etsy?
Yeah, trust and safety is really, really important to us in the marketplace. The Etsy brand is very powerful, and it does allow these millions and millions of sellers to hang out their shingle underneath our brand, and people come there to the marketplace and interact and buy from sellers in large part because the brand of Etsy that hangs over the marketplace. So it's really important that we police it, that we protect it. And you're right, we have used for many years everything from very simple to now very sophisticated algorithms. And there are really just dozens and dozens of events that will trigger these models to look at items, listings, transactions, communications. All of this triggers models to look at it that can then flag it for trust and safety expert agents to look at that and say, is that a real listing? Is it really handmade? Does it all of these triggers allow humans to then interact with that and make determinations. We've also made tremendous progress on IP infringement. As companies want to protect their intellectual property. We want to support that. And so we built an entire portal that allows companies to report, and then we can respond immediately to items based on that. So that's been a big push. And now even the more sophisticated, we're using computer vision to help us look for items that, can we determine whether they're handmade or not handmade, flag them, can they be found on other e-commerce, sort of mass e-commerce marketplaces, as opposed to being actually unique and handmade. And so computer vision is starting to become really a big tool in that toolbox for trust and safety. And all of that, exactly like you said, and it goes to everything from keeping the listings handmade to monitoring for account takeovers when people lose their accounts to nefarious actors who are out there trying to take it over. And we're trying to monitor, as you can imagine, the scale of this. You can't do it with just people. You need that combination of people and machine learning to do that.
Yeah, totally. Marketplace trust and safety, obviously an industry-wide topic, especially on platforms like Etsy's, which enable such great levels of creativity. And it's awesome to hear, a lot of the new algorithmic approaches like computer vision, as well as lots of the fraud detection algorithms have helped us catch a lot of these issues. What do you think is the sort of future industry-wide, broadly within e-commerce for marketplace trust and safety, and how do you think that's going to evolve?
I think the same thing that we're going to see much more sophisticated. We're going to start to see, neural networks, deep, neural networks in these models that today have been fairly, simplified. And at the scale that we're transacting and others are transacting at, we've got to be able to do this at such a high success rate or accuracy rate that we can do this automated. And I think that's the sort of next steps for us and for probably many other companies is not only detecting and flagging stuff, but actually taking actions that then could get reviewed, but really doing this at such a scale. I think that's there, but that of course requires really, really precise accuracy. And I think that takes, much more, sort of training and work in these areas. And so that's I think the future of this is being able to do this, as well as right now our sort of trusted agents that they're, with how they bring their expertise. I think doing that in a much more automated fashion is sort of next level.
So a key part of Etsy as a company, and we'd come up earlier in the conversation as well, sort of a lot of the online testing capability. So experimentation being sort of a key role in a lot of the product development and a lot of what you all have built. Maybe explain that journey a little bit to all of us around Etsy's sort of foundation in A/B testing and online experimentation.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we've really benefited from is how quickly not only can we pivot, make decisions and pivot, but also how quickly we can deploy code. That the observability and the CI/CD pipeline and all of that has really given us so much ability, and that's the sort of foundation. So it starts there. That's a bit of sort of the secret weapon at Etsy is having that ability. The culture, which we could totally talk about as well, and having a blameless post-mortem process, having an inclusive and open culture, all of that is sort of the underlying infrastructure that allows us to then experiment very rapidly. And the importance of that is that it is not uncommon in the industry that if you test the benefit of a change, that it might be, your success rate might be below 25%. And these are not random ideas. These are ideas that product managers and engineering managers are coming up with that are very thoughtful, and they really 100% believe that this is going to improve the experience. And across the industry, there's tons of articles that show to see a fairly low percentage of things that actually do make a statistically significant impact is not uncommon. And so when you think about that, that means that if you're not testing, but you're putting forward just good ideas, 75% of the time, you're likely either neutral or actually wrong. You're actually hurting the experience. And there's lots of reasons for this. One of the reasons that I sort of think about is we all know our products way, way more and better, much more in depth than our typical users, in our case, the buyers and sellers, because we interact with it and think about it all day long. And we've done that for years, right? Sometimes, we've got buyers that will come back once a year or twice a year or 3 times a year, and they're going to interact with our site for 15 minutes or 30 minutes. And their level of sort of knowledge about it is very different. And so what resonates for me as an Uber or my product manager as an Uber power user might not resonate with a buyer who's trying to find, doesn't know that, oh yeah, that button is on the left bottom page, corner of the page. And so testing is critical because you don't know until you put it in front of your customers of what's going to resonate with them. And so the A/B experimentation platform that we've built is really, really important. And we use it for almost everything we do to make sure that the changes we make are going to be positive for the buyers and sellers. So that's kind of why we use it and why it's so important and powerful. And and we've of course stood on the shoulders of giants out there that have do also some awesome A/B experimentation. But I think it's one of the things that really differentiates us.
Yeah, and just so for a sense of scale, how at any one moment or throughout the course of the year, how many variants do you all try out? Like what does the pace of experimentation look like?
Multiple dozens of experiments at any one time.
Awesome. Yeah. So there's probably, given all the permutations, there's probably thousands of or hundreds or tens of thousands of different possible permutations of Etsy's site at any one moment.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. And you can imagine the infrastructure necessary to keep track of that and to make sure that we're not seeing, skew within buckets and that we're actually routing, a buyer who's seen maybe one variation back when we see them again to the same variation. Very, very complex. We have, teams that not only support the infrastructure, but I mean, the other thing that I think we do that it shows how important this is. So we, of course, work in small product development teams that are typically 6 to 12 people. They're comprised of an engineering manager, their engineers, a product manager. If it's sort of front end focused, it will have a designer. And then I think the thing that's a little different is we have analysts assigned to every single one of the squads. And these are data analysts who understand the statistics and they understand the experimentation. And they then can help that team make decisions about whether an experiment is showing skew or it needs to be ramped or needs to be ramped down. And I think that's really how much we think this sort of data-driven approach, how important that is that we have analysts on all of them.
You'd mentioned earlier this idea of offline testing in addition to online testing, both these being really core, especially for a lot of the model development, where oftentimes you have to test more aggressively as you do models and experiments on those models. How else are you sort of evolving your thinking when it comes to experimentation and A/B testing? Like, how else are you trying to sort of evolve and innovate on the approach to experimentation?
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting things in experimentation that we're looking at. Everything from trying to solve what is known in the industry as the winner's curse. When you choose the winner of experiments, it can overstate the benefits. So working on things like that, we're working on moving into a more Bayesian approach, a probability approach. So instead of looking at things like power and p-values that today are treated fairly deterministically, that you either meet the statistical significance or you don't, looking at more probability based. So there's lots of really, I think, innovative, interesting, cool changes that are coming around. This is definitely not an area that's static at all. It's very dynamic. The sort of knowledge is increasing significantly, and it's really great. We've actually hosted sort of an online mini conference around this area. And I think there's a lot of tech companies out there that are interested in this space, and so it's a very innovative space and exciting place to be.
Well, one of the areas that also came up a little bit earlier that we had briefly mentioned was engineering cultures, and I think you've written in the past about, for one example, is like how important it is for engineers to write well and sort of be able to explain their thinking. But maybe to kind of touch on that, what are some of the we talked about having a blameless post-mortem process and culture because it's important that the overall business collectively learns. But what are some of the other tent poles that you think about in terms of building a very strong engineering culture at Etsy?
Yeah, you're right. We've had this blameless post-mortem culture for many years, and it's something that when I arrived, I wanted to make sure that we maintained, because I do think the psychological safety that brings is really important. We want to be a learning culture in that we're learning from each other, we're learning from the industry, we're giving back and teaching the industry, and you can only do that in a space that you feel safe. And that's why that blameless postmortem culture is so important, that we fundamentally believe everyone comes to work to do the best job they can. Nobody comes to work and says like, oh, I'm going to mess up today, right? Everybody comes with this positive mindset of like, I'm going to try to make the best decision I can, and they do make the best decision they can at the time. But our systems are massively complex. There are interactions that no one can understand. We've had one recently that a dozen people reviewed, and nobody realized this one tiny interaction. And having the ability to then step back from that and say, open and honestly, well, I didn't know this, and I didn't have this piece of information. I didn't realize the system interacted this way. It teaches all of us, and then we all learn from that. And it's not just one person because they're too afraid to say anything that might, like, oh, I know I'm never touching that again because it broke. Now we all know that. And we know, okay, there's this complexity here within the system. That's really important. So it all, in my mind, revolves around this learning. Many people said like, an incident is a terrible thing to waste, in that I want to learn from it. I want to learn everything I can about it because I don't want to repeat it. I want to keep the site highly available for the buyers and sellers, and I need to learn. Learning is the important piece. And that brings us to the writing that, part of learning is sharing and sharing that knowledge. And we can share it in bunches of ways. We can share it like we're doing today and talking. We can share it through written forms, both internally and externally. And we do a lot of writing, as a lot of companies do, with very technical documents that we write. We call them orange docs, for the Etsy Orange. And these are very technical documents that people are proposing architectures or systems or services or changes. And we have to be able to write clearly and really articulate for those. And then to give back to this community, that we share with people in the technology communities, we need to be able to write. And the blog is one of those ways we write. We have people that write books, that write other things. All of that's important, and it's all because of learning. We want to learn from people, and we want to give back to people by teaching them what we know.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with a lot of what you're saying. Creating learning environments, creating environments where those learnings are shared. But all this stuff, it's harder in practice than in theory, and so it's really amazing what you all have accomplished at Etsy.
Well, thank you. Definitely, the hardest thing is finding the time to sit down and write. And so, we've really tried to thank people when they do that, to make sure that we reach out and say thank you for sharing that, whether it's on our internal blog or the external blog, or the speaking engagements, the meetups that they do, any of this stuff. The stuff that you and your team do, it's so important that we share across the industry. It has, I mentioned sort of standing on the shoulders of giants, that we all do. And we owe it back to each other to share what we've learned as much as possible, as much as we can.
Yeah. To kind of close out here, last question. Obviously the past few years since the pandemic have been some of the craziest years in e-commerce history, and the industry has seen massive growth, and it's so clearly been the sort of direction that the future is pointed. What are you most excited about, just broadly speaking, in terms of the e-commerce industry, but also new technologies being applied to the industry, and what are some of the trends or user experiences or things that you're really excited about that you think we're going to start seeing and are going to start being more possible?
Yeah, I think there's, as I mentioned, the democratization of machine learning. I think making machine learning more accessible, and that means everything from the algorithms and the libraries that we use to also the deployment infrastructure. We've got to make that easy and simple for people to take their models that they've built and get them into production. And of course, along with that is how do you deploy them? How do you observe them? How do you know if they're working properly? How do you know when the data feeds aren't up in sync? All of that. So the democratization more and more is important. I think people are coming out of school and in their careers, and they see how important machine learning is, and they want to be a part of it. So I think that's really, really important. I think we will continue to see the power of human in the loop. I've mentioned a couple times of this, like, we are certainly not at the point where, a ton of our algorithms can be by themselves, that we really need humans either jump-starting data, helping retrain directionally. They can be on the front end, the middle, or the back end of these algorithms and these models, but they are there. And I think leveraging that, I think as technologists, engineers, we usually want to do this all automated. I know if I do something more than twice, I want to write a script for it. But we've got to embrace humans as well. I think this also fits with our mission of keeping commerce human, but we've also found that that's very important. That if we can find ways that we can bring humans into the models and work beside them, that's really the most powerful. So I think those are a couple things. I think on the sort of more cutting edge, I think there are some interesting things in Web3 that some of us Web2 companies, before we dismiss it completely as not in our realm, are interesting. We've talked a lot about data and the importance of that. As a Web2 company, data is one of our most prized possessions. As I mentioned, the algorithms, many of them have been around for years. We borrow from academia. Of course, we try to give back as well. The data is sort of the secret sauce there. And so as a Web2 company, we think about how do we close, protect, and keep that. And a Web3 flips that model a bit and has data and the transactions public permanently. But there are areas in which we do leverage and push data out. Our listings, if people crawl our site, whether it's search engines or other people crawl our site, that's completely public data. In fact, we give it to advertisers, listing data, so that we can advertise. So that might be an area that we could actually leverage some Web3 technologies and frameworks that so I think that's another area that we sort of keep an eye on. There's not a lot of active work, but it's something that I keep thinking about is, we shouldn't just sort of shut that off. I think there's possibilities there to be both a Web2 company that leverages some of this more modern framework.
Yeah, and you touched on a bunch of great themes there. I mean, like, among them, one of them, the human in the loop component that you mentioned. We talked a lot about how AI is actually an augmentative technology, not a replacement technology, and how it's going to augment the decisions that people make and sort of be decision support and improve decision making, as well as allow people to be higher leveraged in their decision making. But again, I think the sort of the concerns or the sci-fi concepts around AI fully automating jobs, A, I don't think it's realistic, but also B, it's not conducive to the best possible technologies and user experiences. And then, yeah, the stuff that you mentioned in terms of the Web3 concepts around data being public or shared in some context, or the user having ownership over that data, and then sort of like allowing folks to key in, I think is really relevant based off how we're how we're seeing the sort of global regulatory environment develop, but also how machine learning is developing. A lot of investment into techniques like federated learning and approaches that will enable us to sort of learn not off of necessarily the data itself, but encrypted versions of that data where you can't trace back the actual original forms. So a lot of exciting technologies, and a lot of exciting ideas, and that we teed up here at the end. Mike, thank you so much again for being here and speaking with me today, and super excited to continue conversations in the future.
Thanks for having me. This was terrific. Really appreciate it.